In the winter of 1883 and 1884, a man named Josiah Crenshaw stood inside his cabin in Briarstone, Wyoming territory and watched his breath turn to ice crystals in the air. The thermometer mounted on his mantelpiece read 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the temperature had dropped to minus 34 degrees. The difference was only 72 degrees. It was the difference between survival and slow, freezing death. Josiah had been burning wood continuously for 3 months straight, 18 cords of it. Each cord cost him $4.50 from Corwin Flagg, the settlement's woodcutter, a total of $81 that winter alone. His entire year's earnings from selling bricks and doing masonry work came to $95. He had spent 85% of his annual income just trying not to freeze to death in his own home. 85%. And he was still cold. He still woke up with ice on the inside of his window panes. He still pulled his blankets in closer every night and wondered if this was the night the fire would go out and he wouldn't wake up at all. But Josiah Crenshaw wasn't thinking about that winter anymore as spring arrived in 1884. He was thinking about the next one. He was thinking about what he had learned in Philadelphia, back when he was an apprentice at Claiborne & Sons Brickworks. He had spent 12 years there, 12 years of hands-on work with clay and fire and the invisible properties of heat that most men never understood. At Claiborne & Sons, Josiah had learned how to identify the perfect clay. Clay that had the right porosity, the right mineral composition, the kind that would fire hard without cracking. He learned how to temper clay, working it with his bare hands for hours, breaking it down, folding it, feeling for air pockets and foreign materials. He learned which clays shrunk most when fired and which remained stable. He learned that clay from different depths in the same riverbank had different firing characteristics. He learned by failing repeatedly. His first 100 brick attempts were failures. Some cracked in the kiln, some came out too soft, some shattered when cooled too quickly. But he persisted. He learned the feel of proper clay consistency, the way it should respond to pressure, the slight resistance that meant it had been worked enough. At Claiborne & Sons, he had also learned the mathematics of the kiln. The kilns there were massive brick structures, 14 feet tall, capable of firing 3,000 bricks in a single burn cycle. Josiah learned that the temperature needed to be controlled precisely. Too cool, maybe 1,800 degrees, and the clay remained porous, almost useless. At 2,000 degrees, the clay became hard but brittle. At 2,200 degrees, the clay achieved its transformation, dense, strong, and most importantly, perfectly stable for heat absorption. He learned to read the kiln by color. When the interior glowed cherry red, it was around 1,600 degrees. When it shifted to bright orange, it was approaching 2,000. When it turned almost white hot, blazing and painful to look at even from a distance, the kiln had reached 2,200 degrees. He learned to maintain that temperature for exactly 7 hours to achieve perfect thermal density in the brick. He learned that different thicknesses of clay required different firing times. 4-inch bricks took longer than 2-inch ones. He learned that the way you stacked bricks in the kiln mattered enormously. Stack them too tightly and the heat couldn't flow between them. Stack them too loosely and the temperature inconsistencies would ruin whole sections of the batch. He learned from the master kiln master, a man named Heinrich, who had come from Prussia and understood clay the way a surgeon understands the human body. Heinrich taught him that fired clay held thermal properties that no other common building material could match. Stone was stable, but slow. Iron heated fast, but also cooled fast. Wood? Wood was useless for thermal storage. It absorbed and released heat like a sponge, inefficient and unpredictable. But fired clay, properly prepared, was different. Fired clay became a thermal battery. It absorbed heat slowly, stored it densely, held it longer than any other material, and released it in a controlled, even manner. A brick that had been heated to 2,200 degrees would maintain that heat storage capacity indefinitely, never degrading, never losing effectiveness. Josiah had spent 12 years watching clay transform. He had learned its secrets. He knew the thermal properties of fired clay better than anyone in the Wyoming Territory. He knew it the way a musician knows an instrument, and that knowledge was about to change everything. Briarstone, Wyoming Territory, sat at an elevation of 5,400 feet on the high plains. In the summer of 1884, the settlement consisted of 18 families. The nearest town of any size was 47 miles away. The winters lasted 6 months. They were absolute. The landscape around Briarstone was stark. Sagebrush, grassland, scattered stands of aspen and pine. Water came from a fast-running creek that froze solid by November. The settlement had one blacksmith, one preacher, one school teacher, 2 merchants with limited stock, and 1 woodcutter. Everything else people needed, they made or grew or did without. Josiah Crenshaw lived in a 1-room cabin of single-layer pine logs with mud chinking between them. The chinking kept out some of the wind, not all of it. The roof was pitch pine shingles with packed earth underneath for insulation. The floor was rough pine plank. The only heat source was a stone fireplace built into the east wall, a massive structure, roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep, made from river stones laid with mortar and lime. The fireplace was efficient for what it was, but what it was a single point of radiant heat in a cold box. All the warmth concentrated at one side of the cabin. Move more than 8 feet from the fireplace, and the temperature dropped precipitously. Move 12 feet away, and you were living in an unheated space. The far corner of Josiah's cabin, the western corner, farthest from the fireplace, stayed below freezing all winter long. He had measured it, 41 degrees one morning in January. Freezing. His water bucket there had iced over. His neighbor was a woman named Alma Lindqvist. She was in her late 50s, a Swedish immigrant widow. Her husband, Gunnar, had been a strong man, a man who could work in cold that would break other people. In January of 1882, just 2 winters before, Gunnar had gone out to the barn to check on the livestock during the night. The temperature that night dropped to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Alma found him in the morning, curled up in the hay, already stiff. He had fallen asleep and never woke up. Since that morning, Alma had lived in terror of the cold. She burned 22 cords of wood every winter, 22 cords to stay alive. Her income came from selling eggs and butter at the settlement merchant, maybe $40 in a good year. Corwin Flagg, the woodcutter, charged her full price, $4.50 per cord. At 22 cords per winter, she was spending $99 every season, more than double her annual income. She was slowly going broke, staying alive. She was slowly starving to avoid freezing. The settlement had no answer for her. Reverend Osgood Hale, the pastor, offered prayer. That was the settlement's answer for everything. Prayer. Josiah Crenshaw had a different idea. He started thinking about it seriously in April of 1884. The thought came to him fully formed one morning while he was firing bricks in his kiln. Watching the temperature inside the brick oven reach 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, watching the clay transform, watching it become hard and dense and incredibly efficient at storing and radiating heat. What if he could capture the heat that was being wasted in his fireplace? What if, instead of letting all that hot exhaust go straight up the chimney and disappear into the sky, he could make it work? What if he could make it heat the entire cabin, not just the area directly in front of the fireplace? The mathematics were simple. His fireplace was burning at roughly 30% efficiency. That meant of all the heat being generated by the wood, only 30% was actually warming his cabin. The other 70%, the vast majority of the energy, was escaping up the chimney as hot exhaust. That exhaust had to be at least 400 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe higher. That was pure waste, energy literally flying into the winter sky. If he could capture that exhaust, make it travel through his pipe system, he could multiply his heating efficiency by a factor of 3, at minimum, maybe more. The plan took shape over several weeks. It was ambitious, it was impractical, it required work, but it was also elegant. Josiah would excavate beneath his cabin floor, dig down 6 feet below ground level, well below the frost line in Briarstone, which was 4 feet deep. At that depth, the soil temperature stayed stable, around 50 degrees even in the deepest winter. That stability was crucial. The ground below the frost line never froze solid in Briarstone. It remained constant, 50 degrees, a thermal anchor. Once he reached that depth, he would lay out a grid network of fired clay pipes across the entire footprint of his cabin. His cabin was 16 feet wide and 20 feet long, 320 square feet of floor space. He would run the clay pipes in a serpentine pattern, one pipe after another, snaking back and forth beneath the floor in carefully calculated rows. The rows would be spaced 18 inches apart, close enough that the heat radiating from each pipe would overlap and create an even thermal field, far enough apart that he could move between them as he laid them. The serpentine pattern meant the exhaust would travel the maximum possible distance through the pipe system, spending maximum time in contact with the fired clay. Every inch of that journey would allow heat transfer to occur. One end of the grid would connect directly to his fireplace exhaust, the hot gases that normally went up the chimney and were wasted entirely. The other end of the grid would vent out through the far wall of the cabin, back into open air. The hot exhaust from his fireplace would travel through the clay pipes underground. The fired clay would absorb the heat. This was the critical part, the part that made the entire system work. Fired clay retained heat 3 times longer than stone, 5 times longer than iron. Fired clay was a thermal battery. The heat would soak into the clay pipes. The clay would hold it. The heat would radiate outward and upward through the 6 feet of packed earth above the pipes. The earth itself would conduct the heat, slowly, evenly, without peaks or cold spots. And that heat would emerge through the cabin floor, gentle even, distributed across the entire 320 square feet of space. The whole floor would become a low-level heat source, not hot, just warm. 55 degrees, maybe 60 degrees in the coldest part of winter. Enough. Enough to make a difference. Enough to live. The cost would be almost nothing. The clay was free. Josiah dug it from the riverbank and fired it himself in his brick kiln. The iron collar fittings to connect the pipes to the fireplace would cost $1.80 from Tomas Aguilar, the settlement blacksmith. The mortar compound to seal the pipe connections would be 60 cents. The iron exhaust cap to finish the vent would be $1. Total cost, $3.40. $3.40. That was his entire system. Josiah presented the plan to the settlement at a Sunday service in May of 1884. He wasn't naive. He brought sketches, measurements, calculations based on his 12 years at Claiborne and Sons. He explained the thermal properties of fired clay, the efficiency of radiant heating, the waste in his current system. He explained that the fireplace was being used at roughly 30% efficiency. Most of the heat was going up the chimney. He explained that by capturing that heat, by making it work in the ground beneath the cabin, he could reduce his wood consumption by 60% or more. He explained that Alma Lindqvist could reduce her wood consumption by the same amount, that she could save maybe $50 a winter, that she could stop going broke staying alive. The silence after his presentation was complete. Then Reverend Osgood Hale stood up. Hale was in his late 50s, a man who had been a preacher in Philadelphia before moving west. He was respected in the settlement. He was also, as it happened, the brother-in-law of Corwin Flagg, the woodcutter. Hale said that Josiah's plan was a defiance of God's design for winter. He said that the Lord had given mankind firewood and fur coats and the good sense to bundle up. He said that trying to heat the ground beneath a cabin was unnatural, prideful, and likely to bring misfortune on whoever attempted it. He said that the cold was part of God's design, a test of faith and character. He said that a man who tried to engineer his way around the cold was a man who didn't trust in the Lord's provision. No. Then he said something specific. He said that Josiah's pride would be his downfall, that tinkering with forces he didn't understand would result in his cabin burning down or worse, that God had designed winter to separate the faithful from the foolish. The settlement nodded. The settlement believed Reverend Hale. Within a week, people were calling Josiah the pipe dreamer. Within 2 weeks, the mockery had spread through all 18 families. At the general store, the owner, a man named Harker, mentioned loudly in front of customers that Josiah was wasting what little money he had. The school teacher, Miss Eleanor, a woman in her 30s, made a comment to Alma Lindqvist about foolish schemes and false hope. When Josiah went to the blacksmith shop to discuss the iron fittings with Tomas Aguilar, he heard snickering from men hanging around outside. The woodcutter, Corwin Flagg, was publicly skeptical of the plan, which made sense because if Josiah succeeded, Flagg would sell less wood and make less money. Flagg said it openly at the settlement meeting. Man's trying to engineer his way past winter. Winter always wins. He said it like it was obvious, like Josiah was a fool. The preacher's skepticism gave everyone else permission to laugh. Alma Lindqvist said nothing. She watched Josiah with steady, intelligent eyes. She had lost a husband to the cold. She knew what it cost. She had seen what winter was capable of. But she said nothing publicly. To speak in favor of Josiah's plan would be to separate herself further from the community. Josiah began construction alone in June of 1884. He lifted the floorboards of his cabin section by section, starting at the far end away from the fireplace. He excavated beneath each section, pickaxe and shovel, cutting through the dense clay soil. The soil in Briarstone was heavy clay, perfect for his purposes, but brutal to dig. Clay-rich earth doesn't break easily. It compacts. It resists. It requires force. Each square foot took an hour of hard labor in summer heat that could reach 86 degrees at midday. 6 feet down, 320 square feet. That was 1,920 hours of digging if he did it all. He worked from dawn until the heat of the afternoon made it impossible, then rested in the shade and worked again in the late afternoon. His hands developed blisters on top of blisters. The blisters opened and bled. He wrapped them with cloth and kept working. The cloth would stick to the open wound. He would soak it off in water, apply more cloth, and dig again. By the end of June, he had excavated 40 square feet of floor space, a narrow corridor running the length of his cabin. The clay he removed, he saved. He would use it. He had plans for it. Through July, working in his brick kiln during the hottest part of the day, Josiah fired 180 clay pipe sections. The process was methodical. He hand-formed each pipe carefully, measuring the diameter precisely at 4 inches and the length at 14 inches, a standard size that would connect properly with the iron fittings that Tomas Aguilar was forging. He shaped each pipe on a clay wheel, one after another, his hands knowing the exact pressure to apply. He let them dry for 3 days in the sun before placing them in the kiln. He fired them at the exact temperature he had learned at Claiborne and Sons, 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the clay undergone a complete transformation. The molecular structure changed. It became ceramically stable. It would never absorb water again. It would never lose its structural integrity. It would hold heat indefinitely. He maintained 2,200 degrees in the kiln for exactly 7 hours for the 4-inch pipe thickness. Too short, and the firing would be incomplete. Too long, and the pipes would begin to overglaze and become brittle. Each pipe, when finished, weighed roughly 8 pounds. He stacked them carefully after they cooled to avoid cracking. By mid-July, he had 180 finished pipes ready for laying, stacked neatly in his storage area, each one identical, each one perfect. That was 1,440 pounds of fired clay, all of it created with his own hands in the kiln, all of it thermal batteries waiting to be used. Tomas Aguilar, the blacksmith, was the only person in the settlement who didn't mock the project. Aguilar was in his early 30s, a Mexican-American man who had come to Briarstone 5 years earlier. He understood engineering. He understood that problems had solutions. He understood that the old ways were not the only ways. Aguilar forged the iron collar fittings precisely, each one capable of connecting 2 clay pipes with a watertight seal that would hold under pressure. He forged them carefully, testing each one for tolerances, making sure the fit was exact, checking them multiple times. 58 collar fittings in total, each one identical, each one perfect. Josiah paid him the $1.80 without complaint. In late July, Josiah began laying the clay pipes beneath his cabin floor. He had excavated enough space now. The narrow corridor was ready. He laid the first pipe horizontally, connecting it to an iron fitting that led from his fireplace exhaust. He connected the second pipe to the first using an iron collar. He sealed the joint with a mortar compound he mixed himself. Lime, clay, sand, in the right proportions for durability and thermal conductivity. Then the third pipe, then the fourth. The serpentine pattern began to take shape. He worked slowly, carefully. A crack in a pipe, a loose connection, and the whole system would fail. The settlement watched. Children came to peer down into the excavation beneath Josiah's cabin. Adults shook their heads and made comments. The pipe dreamer, wasting his time and his money. That poor fool. In August, Josiah expanded the excavation. Now he was digging not just beneath the corridor, but beneath the main living space of his cabin. The summer heat was intense, elevation or not. Midday temperatures in Briarstone reached the upper 80s. Josiah worked in the darkness beneath the cabin, in heat and dust, cutting through clay, hauling the excavated soil up to ground level in buckets, dozens of buckets a day. His back ached constantly, his shoulders burned, his hands were raw. But the grid continued to expand beneath his floor. The pipes multiplied. By late August, he had laid pipes beneath nearly half the cabin. The serpentine pattern was visible now. Neat rows of fired clay pipes connected with iron fittings, all sealed with mortar, all leading back toward the fireplace on one end and toward the far wall on the other. Each row was spaced exactly 18 inches apart. The pattern was perfect. In September, as the evenings grew cool and the mornings began to frost, Josiah completed the excavation beneath the western end of the cabin, the coldest corner, the place where ice had formed on his water bucket in January. He laid the last section of pipes. He installed the iron exhaust cap on the vent that would carry excess air back outside, allowing the system to breathe properly without pressure buildup. He connected everything, all 180 pipes, all connected, all sealed, all ready. He had done it alone, every piece of it, the excavation, the firing of the clay, the laying of the grid, everything except the blacksmith work, which Tomas Aguilar had done with precision and care. Now Josiah carefully relaid the cabin floorboards. He packed earth around the pipe network, clay-rich earth that would conduct heat effectively, choosing soil composition that matched the frost line depth and thermal properties he had calculated. He tested the connections, checking for leaks, for loose fittings, for any point of failure. He ran water through the system at low pressure to ensure no cracks were present. There were none. Everything was solid. The system was complete. As autumn arrived in Briarstone, as the first frost touched the grass in the mornings and the nights began to drop below freezing, Josiah Crenshaw had a secret beneath his cabin floor. The settlement was waiting. The settlement was watching. The settlement was certain he had failed. That winter would prove the folly of his plan. That the pipe dreamer had wasted his time and $3.40 that he could have spent on wood. But underneath, in the darkness 6 feet below the floor, the clay pipes waited. They were ready. They knew what to do. The system was finished by the last week of October, and Josiah spent 3 days replacing the floorboards with meticulous care, making sure each plank sat flush and level. The clay mortar he'd mixed by hand, a blend of clay, sand, and water, sealed every connection in the underground grid, creating an airtight network that would channel heat instead of losing it to the soil below. On November 1st, he filled the gaps between the floorboards with packed earth and sawdust, sealed the joints one final time, and stepped back to look at his work. From above, you couldn't tell anything had changed. The cabin looked the same, but underneath, he'd transformed it into something that shouldn't be possible on the Wyoming frontier in 1884. The first test came 3 days later, on November 3rd, when the thermometer outside read 19 degrees below zero, and the wind was moving steady from the northwest at sustained 18 miles per hour, gusting higher through the cottonwood trees that bordered the property. Josiah woke before dawn, his breath visible in the cabin's interior darkness, and laid out kindling in the fireplace, oak and pinyon, the hottest burning woods, carefully arranged to establish maximum draft without overwhelming the system he'd spent 3 years designing. He waited for the light to come, watching the eastern window transition from black to gray. At 6 o'clock in the morning, he struck the flint, caught the spark, and blew until the fire caught. The flames grew, climbing up the chimney, and he positioned the metal deflector he'd installed, a simple angled sheet of steel that would force the exhaust gases down into the clay pipe entrance instead of letting them rise straight up and escape to the sky like every other cabin in Briarstone. The fire burned steady and moderate, nothing dramatic, just enough to establish good draft without wasting heat, the interior temperature rising gradually from 48 degrees at eye level to 52 degrees. By 9 o'clock, 3 hours after the fire had caught, when Josiah knelt and pressed his hand against the floorboards, he felt something he'd only imagined before: warmth spreading through the wood, distributed evenly across the entire floor surface, not hottest near the fire, but consistent everywhere. He went to the cellar and positioned a metal thermometer against the floor from below, watching the mercury rise in increments, documenting the rate of heat transfer through the clay pipes. By noon, with the fire still burning but settled into coals, maintaining a steady release of heat, he checked the reading. 52 degrees Fahrenheit on the floorboards, measured 5 times across different locations, and never varying by more than 1 degree. The air temperature in the cabin had risen to 58 degrees, measured at eye level 3 feet from the floor, with another reading at 7 feet showing 56 degrees, the heat rising as expected, but distributed far more evenly than any conventional cabin. With one moderate fire burning for just 4 hours, consuming approximately 14 pounds of carefully measured cordwood, he'd raised the interior temperature by more than 10 degrees and sustained it. Josiah let the fire die to ash, sealed the fireplace opening with a sheet of canvas to prevent cold air from descending through the chimney, and waited with his hand-marked thermometer, recording readings every hour. At 3 in the afternoon, he checked the temperature again, 50 degrees on the floor. At 6 in the evening, 48 degrees. At midnight, 12 hours after he'd let the fire burn down to nothing, the floorboard still registered 47 degrees on the thermometer, and the cabin's air temperature was holding at 51 degrees. The heat loss over those 12 hours measured at just 6 to 7 degrees, a retention rate that meant the underground clay pipes were holding and slowly releasing the thermal energy from a single 4-hour fire. The clay pipes had captured the heat from those 4 hours of burning and were releasing it slowly, steadily, passively warming the entire structure through the night without any fire at all, proving that the system functioned exactly as the mathematics he'd worked through suggested it would. Josiah sat in his chair in the dark cabin, surrounded by this invisible warmth moving beneath his feet, and understood that he'd done something the settlement hadn't believed was possible. He went to bed on top of his quilts instead of under them, and for the first time in his life on the frontier, he slept warm through an entire winter night. The next morning, he sent word through Thomas Aguilar that Alma Lindqvist should come to the cabin. Alma had lost her husband Gunnar 2 winters before. He'd been out checking the north pasture fence during a cold snap. His horse went lame, and he'd tried to walk back 5 miles through temperatures that dropped to 40 below. They found him 2 days later, half buried in a drift. The settlement said he'd been careless. The settlement had harsh thoughts about Alma, as if grief was something she should have managed better, as if the cold was a test she'd failed him in. She came to Josiah's cabin on foot through new snow, wearing Gunnar's old coat and 2 pairs of stockings, her breath fogging in the terrible air. When she stepped inside and closed the door, Josiah saw her pause, her entire body going still. She looked down at the floorboards, then back up at Josiah with an expression he couldn't quite read. Without speaking, she sat on the bench beside the fire, and slowly, carefully, as if the motion might shatter something, she removed her boots and her stockings and pressed her bare feet against the warm wood. She stood that way for a long time, her eyes closed, her hands folded in front of her. When she opened her eyes, tears were streaming down her face. "Gunnar would have lived," she said. That was all. Just those 4 words spoken to the floor, the fire, the invisible grid of heat beneath them. Josiah didn't try to comfort her or argue with her. They both understood what the system meant. They both understood what it might have changed. Word spread through Briarstone, despite the mockery that had followed Josiah for 3 years. Corwin Flagg, the woodcutter, came to the cabin in mid-November and asked to see the system. Josiah showed him the deflector, explained the clay pipes, let him feel the warm floorboards. Flagg said nothing while he was there. He knelt, pressed his hands flat against the wood, and his expression didn't change. But when he stood up and walked to the door, Josiah saw something in his jaw, a tension that hadn't been there before. Flagg had a business selling firewood to the settlement, cordwood stacked in his yard, a contract with most of the families to deliver their winter supply. If Josiah's system worked at scale, if it could reduce a family's wood consumption from 20 cords to 3 or 4 cords, Corwin Flagg's livelihood was in question. He left without speaking, and Josiah didn't expect him to return. Reverend Osgood Hale preached the following Sunday about false prophets and earthly schemes, about the danger of men who put their trust in mechanisms instead of providence, about how the Lord provided warmth through natural means, stacked wood, burning fires, the fellowship of gathered faithful. He didn't mention Josiah by name, but every person in that church knew who he was talking about. The Reverend's voice carried that edge it always did when he was pointing out someone's presumption, someone's attempt to rise above the natural order of things. But Josiah noticed that 2 families who usually sat with Reverend Hale had shifted slightly in their pews, their eyes aimed at the rafters instead of at his face. Winter arrived brutal. December brought temperatures that ranged from 28 below to 35 below, day after day after day. The kind of cold that made even the settlement's most resilient men talk about moving, about heading to California or Oregon, about the frontier being a punishment for the sinful and the foolish. January came worse. The first week of January brought a blizzard that lasted 6 days without pause, sustained winds creating wind chills that pushed toward 45, 50, maybe lower. The settlers didn't have instruments to measure that far down, with snow falling at rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour, accumulating in drifts that broke the measurement scale of human understanding. Snow drifted 8 feet high against the cabin walls, some drifts reaching 12 feet where the wind channeled the flow. Fence posts disappeared entirely beneath the white mass. Paths between houses vanished as if the settlement had never been planned, had never existed. Men had to tie ropes from their cabins to their barns to keep from getting lost in the whiteout between 2 buildings 20 feet apart. And even then, some men became confused, following the wrong rope, freezing to death 50 feet from shelter because they couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. The settlement's 18 families burned everything. By the second week of January, families had moved past seasoned wood and into green wood, wet wood that barely caught, that filled their cabins with smoke so thick it burned the eyes and choked the lungs. Children developed hacking coughs that lasted for hours. The elderly suffered fevers as respiratory inflammation set in. Smoke hung in the air so densely that families couldn't see from one corner of their cabin to another, and the wood was so wet that families burned twice as much to generate the same heat, consuming 3 or 4 cords per week instead of the normal 3 per month. Corwin Flagg's stockpile ran out on January 8th because he'd sold so aggressively in October and November, convinced he'd have time to recut and stack more. He hadn't. He'd miscalculated the severity, or he'd gambled on it being mild, or he'd been too focused on Josiah's system working to think about his own supply. Whatever the reason, his woodpile was gone, and by January 10th, his cabin was dropping toward 20 degrees in the evenings. He started pulling apart his fence, then his barn doors, burning wood that had taken him years to fell and build. The Gardner family, 5 people in a small cabin, brought their 3 milk cows and 2 chickens inside, sealed the gaps in the walls with canvas, and huddled with the livestock for shared body heat. The arrangement kept the cabin above 30 degrees, but filled the air with animal waste and breath fog so thick you couldn't see across the room. The smell became unbearable, ammonia from urine mixing with damp straw and unwashed bodies in an enclosed space. The youngest child developed a skin infection from the constant moisture and contamination. The Pearson family did the same thing with their animals and added straw to the floor, transforming their cabin into something closer to a barn than a home, with hay piled in corners and the family sleeping on layers of straw that had to be replaced every 2 days as they became soaked and filthy. The settlement's one functioning well froze solid to 12 feet deep, the water unable to move because the temperatures never rose above 15 degrees in daylight, ice accumulating in a solid plug that hand pumps couldn't break. Families had to melt snow for water, burning precious fuel just to drink, calculating whether it was better to conserve fuel and go thirsty, or burn wood and face the uncertainty of whether next week would bring resupply. On January 11th, in the deep cold, when the settlement was burning everything movable and still not staying warm, the wind picking up to 45 miles per hour, sustained with gusts exceeding 60, Alma Lindqvist came to Josiah's door at 2 a.m. Her cabin had dropped to 19 degrees, despite every fire she could manage. She'd run out of cut wood. Her fingers were numb, beginning to lose feeling, the first stage of frostbite. She was starting to make mistakes in thought, the early signs of cold sickness, her mind becoming sluggish and difficult to navigate. Josiah took her in without hesitation, installed her in the chair nearest the fire, and gave her hot broth and blankets. 2 hours later, her cousins arrived, the Lindqvist family of 5, who'd fled Minnesota for what they thought would be better country. They were half frozen, desperate, begging for shelter until the blizzard passed. Josiah made room. Old Ephraim Cutler came to the door at dawn, 78 years old, alone, with frostbite already blackening the edges of his ears and fingers, his eyelashes crusted with ice, his breath coming in wheezing gasps. Josiah brought him in and laid him in front of the fire, removing his frozen clothing piece by piece, gradually warming his extremities to prevent the shock that could stop his heart. By that afternoon, the Hale family arrived at the cabin door. Reverend Osgood Hale, his wife Margaret, and their 2 grown sons, all of them in fine coats that weren't fine enough for that cold, all of them with desperation in their eyes that Josiah had never expected to see in a man of God. The Reverend had spent the morning in his church trying to maintain the building's temperature, maintaining his position in the community even as the settlement froze. But the cold had finally penetrated even faith, even certainty, and the Reverend stood in the doorway looking smaller than Josiah had ever seen him, diminished by the admission that his prayers had not been enough, that the mechanism Josiah had built was the only barrier between his family and death. The Reverend stepped inside, stood on the warm floorboards, and understood immediately what was happening. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge his previous words from the pulpit about false prophets and earthly schemes. He simply walked to the corner of the cabin, sat on the bench, and remained silent for the entire 3 days. The weight of his silence filled the space more completely than any sermon, a silence that admitted defeat, acknowledged error, submitted to the reality of the warm floorboards and the heat that had arrived not through prayer, but through the stubborn persistence of a man the settlement had called a dreamer. Over those 3 days, 22 people sheltered in Josiah's cabin. 22 people in a space of 320 square feet, packed so tightly they had to shift and adjust constantly, sleeping in shifts because there wasn't floor space for everyone to lie down at once. The mathematics of shelter became visceral. Each person occupied approximately 15 square feet of space, and the cabin contained walls, a fireplace, bunks, furniture that reduced the available floor space. Women organized a rotation system where every 4 hours a new group would lie down to sleep, packed tightly, sharing body heat while others sat or stood or moved slowly through the crowded space. The smell became overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, cooking food, the constant dampness from clothing drying near the fire, the sanitation struggles of 22 people with a single outhouse 50 feet away in conditions where stepping outside meant potential death within minutes. Josiah kept a fire going 6 hours instead of 4 each day, burning 30 to 35 pounds of cordwood daily to compensate for the cold that rushed in every time someone opened the door, for the body heat that actually helped warm the cabin, but also meant constant smoke and the smell of too many people in one space, for the heat loss through the walls and roof that increased as the external wind speeds reached sustained 45 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 60. He monitored the fire with precision, measuring the heat output, adjusting the deflector to maintain the delicate balance between generating enough warmth and avoiding the excess heat that would stress the system. The clay pipe system held. It never failed, never froze, never lost efficiency despite the demands placed upon it. The floor temperature never dropped below 49 degrees, even when 6 new people crowded in from the blizzard and the wind was shaking the cabin on its foundation. Families huddled in corners, taking turns sitting closest to the fire, sharing the warm floorboards with rotating priorities determined by age and vulnerability. There was no fighting. The proximity, the shared ordeal, the visible proof that Josiah's system was the only thing keeping them alive, created a strange unity. Hunger was present, but not critical. Josiah's provisions, supplemented by what a few families had brought, lasted through the 3 days. The women organized efficiently, rotating who would prepare meals using the limited cooking space, who would care for old Ephraim Cutler as feeling returned to his fingers and ears, and the pain of rewarming became its own trial, who would manage the sanitation challenges of 22 people in an enclosed space. Tomas Aguilar, trapped like everyone else, helped keep the fire steady and the cabin maintained, his presence calming to those who were panicking. Children slept, piled together, warm enough to stay alive, to stay safe. Their trust in this shelter absolute and unreasoned. Alma sat with her cousins and didn't cry, her hand pressed to the warm floorboards where Gunnar would have stood had he lived, where his feet would have rested on the same heat that was saving her life. On the 14th of January, the wind changed. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had begun. The sun came out pale and distant, but present for the first time in 6 days. Families slowly filed out of the cabin, moving back into the cold, but at least moving, knowing that fuel supplies had changed, that the worst of the winter was likely past. Some men shook Josiah's hand. Tomas gripped his shoulder and walked out without words, the expression on his face holding something like awe. The Lindqvist cousins thanked him formally, carefully, understanding what he'd done. Alma put on her boots and looked at him, with an expression that held the weight of everything that had happened since Gunnar died, everything that might have been prevented. Reverend Osgood Hale stood from his corner bench, straightened his coat, and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold. He put his hand on the door frame, and for a moment Josiah thought he might speak, might acknowledge, might apologize, might offer some word about faith and mechanisms and the strange ways the Lord provided for those who needed it. But the Reverend simply nodded, a single motion that contained the entire narrative of his failure and Josiah's triumph. A physical admission that his prayers had been less effective than clay pipes and the stubborn refusal to accept what the settlement believed was possible. He stepped out into the bright cold and the new snow. The cabin door closed. The settlement had changed. Everyone had stood on the warm floorboards. Everyone had felt the heat moving beneath their feet without any fire burning, without any visible source, without any explanation other than the clay pipes running 6 feet underground, the deflected exhaust, the heat that refused to dissipate. Reverend Hale's words about earthly schemes and false prophets had been tested against the lived experience of 22 people who had survived a blizzard because a pipe dreamer had believed in something impossible. No one in Briarstone could unknow what they'd learned. No one could forget standing in that warm cabin while their own homes froze and burned and demanded everything they had. The question now wasn't whether Josiah Crenshaw was right. The question was what happened when an entire settlement understood that the old way of living through winter had been accepted not because it was necessary, but because no one had thought to challenge it. The question was what changed next. Spring came to Briarstone in 1885, and with it came the reckoning. The snow melted off the high country in rivers, and the settlement could finally take stock of what the winter had taken from them. Across the Wyoming Territory that season, 340 head of cattle died in the drifts. Men had counted them, or what was left of them, when the spring roundup began. 2 settlements that Briarstone rarely heard from had lost families to the cold. In Elk Ridge, a father and son froze inside their own cabin when the stovepipe collapsed, and no one had the materials to fix it before the cold seeped in. In Flint Creek, a widow ran out of wood 3 weeks before spring and made the choice that so many frontier families made. She wrapped herself in everything she owned and went to sleep. The cold took her that way. These were not statistics. These were neighbors, or neighbors' neighbors, or people whose names reached Briarstone in the mail that came when the passes opened. And in Briarstone itself, nobody died, not one person. 22 people had survived in a cabin 320 square feet in size during a blizzard that bottomed out at minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Because one man had believed that the right system could do what no amount of prayer or stubbornness could do alone. They called him the pipe dreamer. Josiah Crenshaw didn't gloat. That wasn't his way. He didn't stand in the settlement square and tell Reverend Hale that he'd been wrong, or that pride had nearly cost lives, or that the old ways of freezing through winter, because that's how people had always done it, were exactly that, old. He did something better. He taught. The first person he taught was Alma Lindqvist. In May of 1885, with the ground thawed enough to dig, Josiah spent 2 weeks excavating beneath her cabin. Her place was smaller than his, 14 feet by 16 feet, totaling 224 square feet. And so the system had to be adjusted. Fewer pipes, a more efficient layout, the heat concentrated where it mattered most. He and Tomas worked out the mathematics of it together. How far apart should the pipes run? What diameter worked best for a smaller footprint? How much clay was necessary? They tested combinations on paper first, then in the earth. When they fired the pipes, the temperature had to reach exactly 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit to achieve the proper vitrification. Too cool, and the clay remained porous, letting heat escape and reducing the system's ability to transfer warmth from the central heating chamber to the cabin above. Too hot, and the clay became brittle and cracked under thermal stress, creating leaks and dead zones where heat couldn't flow. Josiah had learned this through the brutal trial of his own cabin, knowing now what temperatures worked, what didn't, what left his floor consistently warm versus what created hot spots and cold zones. He had kept detailed records in a leather journal, noting that his installation had required 47 individual clay pipe segments, each 8 inches in diameter, and that the excavation had extended to a depth of 2.5 feet below the cabin's subfloor to ensure adequate insulation between the heating system and the frozen earth beneath. For Alma's smaller cabin, they calculated they would need only 23 pipe segments, arranged in a tighter grid pattern with 18-inch spacing rather than the 24-inch spacing he'd used in his own home. This would increase the cost of labor, but reduce the total amount of clay required and lower the complexity of the firing process. Josiah refused payment from Alma beyond the cost of materials and Tomas's labor, which came to $2.94. When she tried to give him money for his own weeks of work, he told her that he'd already been paid once by knowing his system worked. She wanted to argue, but Josiah was quiet in a way that made argument pointless. Instead, she invited him to dinner. This became a pattern. By the time Alma's system was complete, they had developed a routine. He arrived at dawn. They worked until noon, Josiah and Tomas digging the trench, measuring out the precise grid, hauling clay pipe segments from where they'd been stacked on her property. They ate together. He worked until dusk, often by lamplight in the evenings when the foundation needed final adjustments. They ate together again. This went on for 2 weeks. The excavation had been harder than anticipated because the soil beneath her cabin contained ancient frost heave that made digging unpredictable. Some patches of earth came loose easily. Others remained half-frozen despite the May warmth, forcing Josiah to use a pickaxe rather than a shovel. On one afternoon, the trench wall partially collapsed, and Josiah and Tomas spent 3 hours rebuilding it, shoring it up with wooden supports, ensuring the clay pipes would rest on a completely stable foundation. Alma brought them water and bread while they worked, and Josiah noted aloud that a poorly supported pipe could crack under the weight of soil and the thermal stresses of repeated heating cycles. The work mattered because the system would carry heat every winter for decades. When the first cold snap came that following November, a bitter drop to 18 degrees Fahrenheit that caught everyone by surprise, Alma's cabin floor read 54 degrees when tested with a simple mercury thermometer. She could feel the heat rising from beneath her feet when she stood in the morning, a radiant warmth that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once rather than from a single direction. She wrote a letter to her sister in Minnesota describing the system in detail. She described Josiah's hands, which were calloused from digging and marked with clay stains that no amount of washing could fully remove. She described the way he checked the pipe's temperature with a piece of thin metal that he'd fashioned into a gauge, a bent strip of copper that he would hold just above the clay pipe surface without touching it. Watching how the metal's color shifted from dull orange to bright orange as the heat emanated upward during the firing process, a technique he developed through intuition and experimentation. She described the logic of it: heat from below, radiating upward, staying in the cabin instead of escaping through the roof like smoke. She described how she no longer woke shivering, how the cold that had characterized her mornings for her entire adult life had simply ceased to exist. That letter got passed around. Minnesota was a cold state, and people there understood what it meant to wake up warm in winter. By the summer of 1886, Josiah had helped install clay pipe systems in 6 more cabins in Briarstone. He taught each family the process. He drew diagrams on butcher paper, showing the layout with precise measurements, the spacing of pipes calculated by cabin size, the diameter specifications for different building footprints. He explained the firing process in detail: the temperature needed to achieve proper vitrification, the duration of the firing, which typically lasted 6 to 8 hours, depending on the kiln size and the type of wood fuel used, the clay composition, which required testing to ensure the right ratio of sand and mineral content. You needed clay with the right ratio of sand and mineral content. You needed it fired hot enough, but not too hot. You needed to know that if the kiln temperature was off by 50 degrees, you could compromise the entire system's lifespan. A system fired too cool might only last 15 to 20 years before porosity degradation became severe. A system fired too hot might develop hairline fractures that would spread over 5 to 10 years of thermal cycling. Each installation cost between $2.80 and $4.50, depending on the cabin size and how much excavation was necessary. For a settlement where families earned maybe $8 a month in cash, these costs were significant, but so was the wood they no longer had to cut and haul and burn. A typical Briarstone cabin burned 20 cords of wood in winter. That was roughly 160 man-hours of labor for felling, splitting, and stacking, plus the cost of tools and the wear on draft animals. Corwin Flagg, who had built his firewood business on the assumption that Briarstone would always need as much wood as he could provide, watched his revenue drop 60% in 2 years. He was a smart man. He pivoted. He began selling lumber for cabin reconstruction instead. Families whose floors had been dug up for pipe installation needed new floorboards. Families installing systems sometimes decided to rebuild their entire floor while they had the chance, replacing rotted timbers and widening doorways and leveling foundations that had settled unevenly over decades. Corwin became wealthy again, just differently. The competition wasn't about how much wood a man could cut anymore. It was about how much a man understood about construction and planning. Reverend Hale never publicly acknowledged that Josiah had been right. His pride wouldn't allow it. But in the winter of 1886, the church received a clay pipe heating system. Hale didn't ask Josiah for help. Instead, he had his own sons dig beneath the church building, using Josiah's butcher paper diagrams as a guide. The church was 32 feet by 48 feet, a substantial 1,536 square feet, and the pipe grid required 61 individual clay pipe segments to adequately heat the space. The system they installed worked at approximately 80% efficiency because the pipes weren't fired hot enough during their test run. The young men hadn't known what they were looking for, and Josiah, when asked by one of them what temperature should be achieved, simply said the right temperature would be obvious to anyone who understood clay. It was a cryptic answer, but Hale's sons figured it out eventually through trial and error, building a second kiln and firing test segments until they achieved the characteristic color change that indicated proper vitrification. That winter, Hale held church services in a warm building for the first time in his ministry. People remarked on it. Visitors from other settlements remarked on it. Hale would change the subject quickly when anyone asked how he'd achieved it. But the warm church became part of his reputation, and people who might have ignored his sermons came because they could finally feel their fingers, because they could hold their children on their laps without the children shivering through the liturgy. By 1888, 11 of Briarstone's 18 cabins had clay pipe heating systems installed. The average winter wood consumption per household dropped from 20 cords to 4 cords. That's an 80% reduction. At current territory prices of $3 to $4 per cord, that meant a collective savings of $700 to $800 per winter. Money that families could redirect toward food, medicine, tools, livestock, or education. Children attended school more regularly because they weren't kept home to help haul wood. Women had more time for pursuits beyond survival. Families were healthier because they could maintain consistent warmth. Respiratory infections dropped dramatically. The settlement recorded 0 cases of pneumonia in the winter of 1887 to 88, compared to 5 cases in the winter before Josiah's cabin was completed. Children survived the season at better rates. The settlement was becoming known for something other than its harsh winters. Word reached the mining camps. In 1889, a foreman from the Sweetwater mine rode to Briarstone specifically to see Josiah's cabin. The mine had a critical problem. They had 40 miners living in a single bunkhouse, and in winter, that building barely stayed above 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Men were catching pneumonia at alarming rates. During the winter of 1887 to 88, 12 of the 40 miners had been incapacitated by illness. Productivity dropped 40%. They were losing miners not to collapse or accident, but to illness. The foreman asked Josiah if his system could scale. Josiah studied the bunkhouse. 120 feet long, 40 feet wide, 4,800 square feet. His cabin was 320 square feet. That was a 15-fold increase. Could you fire clay pipes at larger diameters? Could the system maintain temperature across that much space? Josiah and Tomas consulted on a scaled-up version. They designed a system using 12-inch diameter commercial clay pipes, larger than anything Josiah had used before, manufactured by a pottery works in Boulder, Colorado, arranged in a grid beneath the bunkhouse floor. The pipes were spaced 24 inches apart to accommodate the building's larger footprint, requiring 164 individual pipe segments total. The cost for the entire building came to $34 in materials and labor, but the savings justified every penny. In the winter of 1890, that bunkhouse maintained an average floor temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the same as Alma's cabin, achieved through scale and engineering rather than just optimization. The mine reduced its coal consumption by 60%, where the operation had previously burned 25 tons of coal per winter to try to heat the bunkhouse. Now they burned less than 10 tons and achieved superior temperatures. The operation became profitable because they weren't paying to heat a freezing building anymore. The miners worked longer shifts. The mine produced 14% more ore that winter, despite having the same number of workers, purely because those workers weren't sick or lethargic from cold. Word spread. By 1892, variations of Josiah's system were in use across Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado mining camps. The Copper King mine near Butte installed a 6,000-square-foot system. The Elkhorn Mining Company used a similar design in 3 separate bunkhouses. The Carbon County Coal Works adopted the technology for their main office building. Engineers visited Briarstone specifically to consult with him. A territorial engineer published a technical bulletin describing the Crenshaw method, fired clay pipe radiant floor heating. The bulletin included technical specifications derived from Josiah's journals, firing temperatures, pipe diameter recommendations based on building size, 8-inch pipes for structures under 500 square feet, 10-inch pipes for 500 to 1,500 square feet, and 12-inch commercial pipes for larger installations. It included Josiah's name. It included diagrams that looked suspiciously like his butcher paper sketches. Josiah never sought credit, but he got it anyway because the system worked, and because systems that work eventually become known by the name of the person who made them work. Tomas Aguilar saw the opportunity. He opened a business manufacturing standardized iron fittings for pipe heating systems. These fittings were crucial. They allowed pipes to connect to each other, to branch and turn, to accommodate the variations in different buildings' layouts. Without proper fittings, you had a series of individual clay pipe segments, not a system. With them, you had a network that could distribute heat efficiently. Tomas became exceptionally skilled at this work. His fittings were precise and durable. He developed a copper junction fitting that allowed pipes to connect at right angles without losing heat through the connection. He designed a pressure valve that prevented thermal expansion from cracking the pipes during the initial heating phase. By 1895, he was shipping his products to Denver, Helena, and Boise. He employed 12 people in his workshop. He became the wealthiest man in Briarstone. Josiah lived to 83 years old. He never left Briarstone. He lived in the same cabin for 58 years, the cabin where he'd first tested his ideas, where he'd proven that the frontier wasn't a place to simply endure cold, but a place where a man with knowledge could solve it. He installed or advised on over 40 clay pipe heating systems in his lifetime. He never charged for his knowledge, only for the physical labor of digging and installation. He measured and calculated and fired clay and dug in frozen earth well into his 70s. His hands became permanently marked with clay stains. His back developed the permanent curve of a man who had spent decades bent over excavations. But he kept working because the work mattered. He and Alma never married, but she moved into the cabin next door in 1887, and they shared meals every evening for 31 years. In the mornings, Josiah would come to her cabin to check on her heating system, to measure the floor temperature, to inspect the pipes for any signs of stress, to make sure that everything was performing as designed. She would have coffee waiting. In the evenings, they would sit together in her warm cabin and talk about the day, about who in the settlement had come to consult with Josiah, about their own installations, about what was happening in the wider world according to the infrequent newspapers that made it to Briarstone. When the cold came, they were warm. When the isolation of winter threatened to break spirits, they had company. That was worth more than any legal formality. Alma lived to 79 years old. Her cabin floor never dropped below 50 degrees Fahrenheit again after Josiah installed her system. She never lost another person to cold. She outlived 3 husbands and 1 fiancé in her earlier life, all to weather and circumstance and the frontier's indifference. In the warmth of her cabin in her later years, she kept Josiah company, and he kept her warm. Hale lived another 18 years after that winter of 1886. He preached until he was 76 years old. He never mentioned the pipe system from the pulpit, not once, but his warm church became famous in the territory. Visiting pastors commented on it. Missionary preachers traveling through Wyoming made note of it. One of them wrote in a letter, "Reverend Hale's church in Briarstone is the warmest house of worship west of the Mississippi, and he will not explain why. I suspect he has made some arrangement with the climate itself." Hale died in his sleep at 79. His final winter was warm. The Crenshaw method evolved. In the 1920s, engineers at the University of Wyoming, sitting in their modern climate-controlled offices, cited Josiah's original design as a precursor to modern radiant floor heating systems. They had computers and calculations and theories, but the fundamental principle was Josiah's: heat applied from below, radiating upward, distributed evenly through a structure. In the 1940s, an architect named Frank Lloyd Wright designed houses he called Usonian homes. They were affordable housing for working people. Many of them featured a heating system remarkably similar to Josiah's design. Hot water flowing through pipes embedded in concrete floor slabs, installed at depths between 2 and 4 inches below the finished floor surface to optimize heat transfer while maintaining structural integrity. The system maintained water temperatures between 110 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than Josiah's radiant heat from clay, but achieving the same result through the same principle. Wright never credited Josiah in his published works, but the engineering journals did. They traced the lineage. They noted that before hydronic radiant heating became a scientific field, one man in the Wyoming territory had figured out the principle alone, with clay and calculation and the pure desperation to solve a problem. They documented his innovation in academic papers. They cited his technical specifications. They recognized him as the true founder of radiant floor heating technology. Today, radiant floor heating is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Hydronic radiant systems generate approximately $4.2 billion annually in revenue across Europe, North America, and Asia-Pacific regions. Every heated floor in every modern building, in every luxury apartment in New York with heated Italian marble, in every hospital in Berlin where patients recovering from trauma experience the gentle warmth from below, in every government building in Tokyo where bureaucrats work in climate-controlled comfort, traces its engineering lineage back to a man with clay on his hands and $3.40 in his pocket who lived 150 years ago in a place most people have never heard of. Josiah Crenshaw decided that winter wasn't a sentence to be endured. It was a problem to be solved, and in solving it, he changed not just his settlement, not just his territory, but the way the entire world builds structures. Most of the time, the people who make these changes disappear from history. Their names become footnotes. Their faces are forgotten. But the principle they discovered never dies. It gets better, gets refined, gets manufactured at scale, and distributed across the planet. And somewhere, every time someone wakes up warm in a cold season because their floor is heated from beneath, they're benefiting from a man who trusted mathematics over tradition and stubbornness, who believed the frontier wasn't a place to survive, but a laboratory to innovate. If this story warmed your heart, subscribe. We'd love to have you on this journey through the innovations that the frontier gave to the modern world. Share this with someone who needs to hear that one man with the right knowledge and $3.40 in his pocket can change how an entire community survives winter. We'll see you at the next warmth.